Okay, so spiritual reasons you can do it every day?
Oh, sure, yeah,
Yeah.
but you might only do it, for a few years, and then you don't need it anymore. Then again, if there's a health consideration, you can certainly reduce the chances of getting colds and things like that by doing nasal wash on a regular basis. But I think it's really up to each individual.
What is the spiritual benefit of using the neti pot or the bowl of water? What is it actually doing for you spiritually?
Well, it both stimulates and cleanses the subtle nerves in the nasal passages and the sinuses, which is where a lot of activity happens when ecstatic conductivity is coming up in the body.
Yes.
Ecstatic conductivity is basically an arising connection between the brain and the neurobiology in the pelvic region, the sexual neurobiology. It's the expansion of sexuality to become a spiritual, ecstatic conductivity and radiance in the body. So the two opposite poles of that are really the third eye, which includes the point between the eyebrows and going back through the brain and down the stem, and connected in with the sinuses and the septum in particular, which is the central dividing wall in the nasal passages.
Mm-hmm.
That whole area is sort of the northern pole of that ecstatic conductivity. And then the other end of it is the perineum, the anus, and that area, the sexual neurobiology. And then it comes up into the gastrointestinal tract as well, which is what we'll talk about with some of these other techniques. But so to answer your question, the neurobiology in the head and the sinuses, and particularly in the nasal pharynx, in that area, which one of the mudras that we didn't talk about when we did asanas, mudras, and bandhas is Kachari mudra, which is direct stimulation in the nasal pharynx and the nasal passages. So all of that works together during this sort of middle stage when you're getting all these energies going. And what happens is they become self-sustaining, and then you don't need to be doing all that stimulation and cleansing anymore.
I see.
It's just there.
Yes.
The awakened neurobiology is there.
I see. We would go on to cleaning the colon and the intestinal wash. What is your preference there?
Well, the colon cleansing is basically the enema.
Yes.
The colonic. I think that was the term you used.
Yes.
And of course, that's something else that's become popular over the years, although not as popular as nasal wash. There are clinics that you can find around that go for colon cleansing, but that's not really what I'm talking about here in this book, because the kind of colon cleansing we're talking about here is self-administered, and it may even be daily for certain periods of time.
Yes.
Not for a lifetime, but
yes.
In that middle stage when those energies are becoming active and that connection is occurring between the root and the brow, the process of digestion in the GI tract becomes very important in this, and something that's discussed in the book and that we discuss quite regularly in the community as this is happening to people is what we call the nectar cycle. And the nectar cycle is just a term that applies to the overall biological, neurological, and biological process that occurs with the rise of ecstatic conductivity. And there's a chemical component to it. You know, in the GI tract, in the digestive system, what we have is three things that are occurring as ecstatic conductivity is coming up. One of them is food, obviously.
Mm-hmm.
The other one is there may tend to be some accumulation of air in the GI tract.
Mm-hmm.
It occurs naturally. And then the other thing is the rise of sexual energy, which also finds its way into the GI tract. So between those three things, what you have, what the Taoists call an alchemy occurring. In fact, they call that GI tract, when that is occurring, they call it the cauldron. So you have a certain biochemistry going on in the GI tract, and that creates emanations of a subtle substance into the nervous system that we call soma. And that soma circulates through the body, and particularly up into the brain, where it is refined further into a substance that we call nectar. And that nectar comes down through the sinuses, through the nasal passages and pharynx, and it can be noticed as a flowery kind of a aroma at times.
Wow, I've actually experienced that.
And then from there, it goes back down into the GI tract again, down through, normal swallowing.
Yes.
And it further enhances that alchemy that's going on in the GI tract with the food and the air and the sexual essences. So that's why we call it the nectar cycle. It's a cycle that begins with the awakening of ecstatic conductivity, and then that chemistry goes in a circle from the GI tract up to the brain, down through the sinuses, back down into the GI tract, and around like that. So, in fact, in Taoist system, they actually do meditation, and some of their breathing techniques are geared to trace that cycle. They call it the microcosmic orbit. We don't use that in AYT, but we do recognize that the process is going on, and we use all these yogic methods that we've been talking about to promote it. And once it gets going,
yes,
and becomes a normal part of our functioning, it keeps going. So that's when we can back off a little bit. So to answer your question about colon cleansing, keeping the colon clean during the rise of that process is important, and we sense that intuitively when we get there. So we're inclined to do more enemas and keep the colon clean. And that can be a daily practice for a while. I did it daily for over 3 years.
Wow, really? That's intense.
But that was a long time ago.
Yes.
That was back in the 80s. And I rarely use it now. I may do it several times per year now. But at that particular stage on my path, it was very important because I was having that awakening going on, and it definitely helped it.
Now, what about the intestinal wash? You're using salt to induce cleansing of the colon. Is it regular salt? Is it Epsom salts or sea salt?
You can use regular salt. There's also some chemicals that you can buy that achieve the same effect. The intestinal wash is really a much more heavy-duty, energy-draining kind of practice because it really takes everything out of your whole GI tract. Whereas the colon cleansing just comes up to a certain point and then drains back out again.
Right.
The intestinal wash, you're actually drinking several quarts of water with some salt or salt equivalent in it, which then passes through your entire GI tract, and you end up basically with a 1 hour case of diarrhea where everything comes out.
Yes.
It's also the same procedure that's used prior to surgery in the medical community, because when people are performing surgery, particularly on your GI tract, they don't want to be finding food in there.
No.
So it's that same procedure. That I do not recommend to be done very often at all.